This is the Sri Ramana Maharshi satsang, a time to listen, reflect, and deeply meditate. Know yourself and be always free and at peace. Welcome. I'm Richard Clarke, hosting this satsang. I'm not a guru or a teacher. Like you, I love this teaching, so I want to share it. I'm reviewing and commenting on the book Talks with Sri Ramana Maharshi. These are dialogues that were collected by Major Chadwick from 1935 to 1939. This week is talk number 126. Dr. Syed again asks, should anyone desirous of spiritual progress take to action or renunciation? Maharshi replied, do you go out of the self? What is meant by giving up? An American engineer asked about satsang, and Maharshi said, Sat is within us. Another disciple asked, in the book, Who Am I? You have said the heart is the seat of the mind. Is it so? Maharshi replied, the mind is Atman. The disciple asked, is it Atman itself or its projection? Maharshi says, the same. A devotee asks, the Westerners look on the mind as the highest principle, whereas the Easterners think the contrary. Why? And Maharshi replied, where psychology ends, their philosophy begins. This is the experience. The mind is born, we see it. Even without the mind, we exist. There's everyone's experience to prove it. The devotee says Western philosophy admits the higher self as influencing the mind. This talk is pretty wide-ranging, from practice to existence and then the mind. The dialogues, though, have one common thread, the need to look within yourself for truth. In the first dialogue, Dr. Syed asks Ramana about the path to spiritual progress to find the self, specifically whether one should follow the path of action or renunciation. Ramana Maharshi responds by questioning whether we ever truly go outside of our own self. And he asks what it means to give up something. You can only give up something that is temporary to start with. What is permanent, what is always there, can never be given up. His point is that the self is always present, and that the idea of giving up or pursuing something external is based on a misconception, a misidentification of your real identity. Then an American engineer asked Ramana about satsang, which refers to the association or companies of sages or enlightened individuals. Ramana Maharshi's response is that the essence of Sat, which is truth or reality, is within ourselves, that the true association with sages is recognizing the truth within ourselves rather than seeking it externally. Once again, Ramana tells us to look within ourselves, not to the world or other people. We are the truth itself, so why look somewhere else for the truth? Ramana consistently tells us to look within ourselves. The dialogue continues with a question about the heart being the seat of the mind, as mentioned in Ramana's book, Who Am I? Ramana confirms that the mind is essentially the same as the Atman, the individual sense of self. It is the mind that sees itself as an individual. It is this misconception that is resolved by self-inquiry. At its base, without the covering of the mind, the Atman is the true self and identical with Brahman, the absolute self. The questioner asks whether the mind is the Atman itself or a projection of it. Ramana Maharshi's response is that they are one and the same, implying that the mind is a manifestation or expression of the Atman as the mind is projected into an apparent world. Without the Atman, there is no mind. Atman does not need any mind for its existence. Atman with the mind is the sense of being an individual. Atman with no mind is the absolute Brahman. Next, the questioner brings up the difference between Western and Eastern perspectives on the mind. The Westerners tend to view the mind as the highest principle, while Easterners hold the opposite view. Ramana explains that where psychology ends, philosophy begins. He suggests that the mind is limited to the realm of psychology, but beyond the mind lies the realm of philosophy, which deals with deeper truths and experiences. He asserts that even without the mind, our existence continues. And this is a universal experience that can be verified by anyone. Finally, the questioner mentions that Western philosophy recognizes the influence of a higher self on the mind. Ramana does not directly respond to this statement in this dialogue, so we can't provide his specific viewpoint on this based solely on this dialogue. Ramana's silence is an invitation to plunge into your own immediate and direct experience. Does your higher self depend on a mind for its existence? Does the mind depend on the higher self to exist? Which is at the base? Which emerges from the base? Ramana Maharshi's teachings on Advaita Vedanta emphasize the non-dual nature of reality. Advaita says there is ultimately no separation between the individual self and the ultimate reality. The goal is to realize this. Ramana's teachings on Advaita Vedanta emphasize the non-dual nature of reality. Advaita says there is ultimately no separation between the individual self and the ultimate reality. The goal is to realize this unity and recognize that the true nature of oneself is the same as the ultimate reality. In this dialogue, Ramana's responses reflect this understanding. When he questions whether we ever go out of the self and what it means to give up something, he is pointing to the idea that the self is ever present and all pervading. From the perspective of Advaita Vedanta, there is no need to renounce or pursue external actions because the true nature of yourself is already complete and whole and is always the experience, whether noticed or not. When the engineer asks about satsang, Ramana directs the focus inward. He suggests the essence of truth, sat, is within yourself, implying that the true association with the sages is recognizing and realizing the truth within, the sage within yourself. This highlights the importance of self-inquiry and self-realization in the path to spiritual progress. Regarding the mind and the heart, Ramana states that the mind is not separate from the self, but rather is an expression or manifestation of it. This aligns with the Advaitic perspective that everything is ultimately an expression of the same underlying reality. When discussing differences between Western and Eastern perspectives on the mind, Ramana suggests that philosophy begins where psychology ends. While Western psychology focuses on the mind as the highest principle, Eastern thought, particularly Advaita Vedanta, goes beyond the mind to explore the deeper truths and experience of existence. Ramana asserts that even without the mind, our existence continues, which can be experienced and understood by everyone. Ramana's teaching on Advaita Vedanta emphasizes the realization of the non-dual nature of reality and the recognition of the true self. He encourages self-inquiry, self-realization, and turning inward to discover the ultimate truth that lies within yourself. The mind, as an expression of the self, is not separate from it, and true spiritual progress comes from realizing this fundamental unity. So inquire, know yourself, and be always happy and at peace. Now we'll have a talk from Nome, the mind.
The mind resolves itself in the self. The mind is dissolved. The mind is destroyed. These statements and one similar to them we find in the instructions given by the Maharshi, as well as strewn throughout the Upanishads and other scriptures. What is the mind? On the one hand, the Maharshi has said the mind is only a bundle of thoughts. And on the other hand, the Maharshi has said the mind simply does not exist. Regarding the latter instruction, he has said, realizing the mind's non-existence is the direct path for all. What is the mind? When he said it is only a bundle of thoughts, it's to remove the false notion that there is a second knowing entity other than the infinite consciousness. The infinite consciousness in which there is no knower and known, no subject and object, which are illusions that appear only in the waking state of mind and the dreaming state of mind. When he said, this is the direct path for all, to realize the mind's non-existence. What else is this but the profound realization that there is no second identity, no second entity, and therefore no duality? That is, there is no one to say, I know the self, or I do not know the self. Regarded as a bundle of thoughts, the first thought, integrally connected to all the other thoughts, is the notion I. It is merely the barest assumption, hardly a thought. All the other ideas are based upon it. Or from another perspective, all the other ideas are just the idea of I in various guises. Therefore, the inquiry, who am I, puts an end to the mind by showing that it never actually exists. That which was never created is said to perish or dissolve. What else is that resolution, dissolution, or destruction but the knowledge of what is real, in which the unreal has never come to be? What else is loss of the ego but the realization that the self alone exists eternally, and there is nothing and no one else ever? The reality that alone is, for which there is no alternative, for which there is no other, in which there is no differentiation, which is beginningless and endless, is truly called non-duality. Whether you comprehend what is being indicated or not, even now, what is it that so knows? I understand, I do not understand. What is it that knows this? To fathom the depths of your own identity, your own existence, you must inquire more deeply than the perceiving and the conceiving, the perceived and the conceived. For what you are in truth certainly cannot be a body or the senses. And it cannot be the mind or its thought forms. What is it that you call I? What is it that appears as a mind? Existence, which is invariably singular, which alone deserves the name I, what is its nature? The consciousness which is ever shining, synonymous with that existence, which always knows, but is never divided into triads of knower, knowing, and known. What is it? Can there be a mind in that? If all of illusion and its consequent bondage and suffering is just the delusion of the mind, yet the mind itself is found not to exist, what remains? Inquire within yourself to know the knower without superimposing any of the attributes of the known upon the knower. Self-luminous consciousness, self-known, hence self-knowledge, remains. You who are, however you imagine yourself to be, inquire as to who you are. Being, which is unborn and indestructible, utterly formless and undifferentiated, which always is, only as it is, remains as it always is. This we loosely refer to as self-realization. Yet who realizes what? Nevertheless, the falsely assumed ego or mind is nowhere to be found. Bondage is impossible, and immortal bliss is realized as the natural state.
And now we'll take a little time to inquire. Notice that you exist, and you know that you exist without thinking about it or feeling it. You just know. Now inquire, investigate within yourself. Is there ever a time when you are not the self? In waking, dreaming, or deep sleep? Who knows the self? Does the mind know the self? Who knows the mind? Does the mind know itself, or do you know the mind? Who am I? What within myself is always there? What is the nature of my existence? What actually exists? All right, let's close with a chant. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Om. Peace, peace, peace. This is Richard Clarke. Thank you for joining me this week. And know yourself and be always free and at peace.